The coffin was polished to a mirror's shine, but no reflection could hide the stench of betrayal that clung to the air that morning. People often say funerals are about love, about remembrance, but as Clara stood in the center of the old chapel, her black veil trembling with every breath, she realized something far darker. Funerals were also where masks were worn most tightly. The men and women around her spoke in hushed voices, dabbing at eyes that had never shed a single tear for her husband. Their sorrow was rehearsed, their pity an act. She could see it in the way they leaned close enough to whisper, not about Daniel's life, but about his business, his money, his unfinished deal. Daniel, her husband, her only anchor in this world, he had been found crushed beneath a collapsed scaffolding at his own factory. The coroner called it an accident. Police agreed. But as Clara stared at the lifeless oak box that now held the man she had once called her world, she felt a different truth gnawing at her bones. Daniel hadn't just died, he had been removed. The chapel's windows rattled in the wind as the priest droned on, his words hollow against the weight of Clara's thoughts. She lowered her gaze and tightened her grip on the silver locket around her neck, a gift Daniel had given her on their 5th anniversary. Inside was his picture, smiling alive. She held it like a secret weapon against despair. From the corner of her eye, she caught them, 2 men standing just a little too close to one another. Richard Harlow, Daniel's business partner, his jaw sharp and eyes colder than the grave they had dug today. And beside him, Michael Grant, Daniel's closest friend, a man who had once dined at Clara's table, loft in her garden, toasted to her husband's success. Now both of them stood whispering, their lips curling with the faintest smiles, the kind that had no place at a funeral. Clara's blood ran cold. Richard had been Daniel's partner for over a decade, but greed was carved into the lines of his face. He thrived on risk, on bending rules until they broke. Michael was different, softer, charming, the kind of man who wore loyalty like a cloak, only to rip it away when it was least expected. The sight of them together, whispering over her husband's coffin, ignited something inside her chest. It wasn't grief anymore. It was suspicion. The service dragged on, each prayer like a nail in Daniel's coffin, but Clara barely heard any of it. Her mind was alive with shadows, weaving questions she could not silence. Why had Daniel been alone in the factory that night? Why had the security cameras suddenly failed? And why did Richard and Michael, men who should be devastated, look as not though they had already moved on to the next chapter of their lives? When the final hymn ended, Clara rose to her feet, her hands trembling only slightly. Mourners came forward to touch her arm, to offer words that sounded like ash. He's in a better place. Time heals all wounds. Empty phrases repeated like incantations, as if they could erase the fact that Daniel was gone. She nodded, accepted their sympathy, but inside her chest a storm was brewing. The final blow came when Richard approached. His cologne was overpowering, the scent of arrogance wrapped in expensive fabric. He took her hand with a rehearsed gentleness and said, "Clara, if there is anything you need, financial guidance, business matters, even personal support, you can rely on me." The words should have sounded comforting. Instead, they dripped with something else, a hunger. Michael was next, his eyes wet but his smile barely hidden. "Daniel was like a brother to me," he whispered, his voice a performance for anyone nearby. "I'll make sure his legacy is protected." Clara wanted to scream. She wanted to tear off her veil and shout the truth she felt burning inside her, that these men were no mourners, no friends. They were wolves circling her as if she were the last obstacle between them and their feast. But she didn't. Instead, she bowed her head and let them believe she was broken. Let them think she was fragile, weak, lost without her husband. Because while they smirked and whispered, Clara made a silent promise over Daniel's coffin. She would uncover the truth. She would peel away every mask, expose every betrayal, and drag the guilty into the light. And when the time came, she would not weep. She would watch them fall. The coffin was lowered into the earth. As rain began to fall, each drop sharp as glass against her skin, Clara whispered a final goodbye, but her heart no longer belonged to grief. It belonged to something colder, sharper, revenge. The days after Daniel's funeral blurred into a fog of condolences, paperwork, and silence. To the outside world, Clara appeared every bit the shattered widow, quiet, withdrawn, moving like a ghost through her own home. But beneath that veil of sorrow, something else stirred, suspicion sharpened into purpose. She began with Daniel's study. A room she had once entered only to deliver tea or straighten a stack of papers, now became her sanctuary. She spent long hours locked away, combing through drawers, ledgers, and files her husband had left behind. Daniel had always been meticulous, his handwriting neat, his records precise. Yet the deeper she searched, the more she discovered fragments that didn't add up, contracts with unusual clauses. Misting funds disguised as maintenance costs, insurance policies renewed just weeks before his death. And tucked inside the bottom drawer, hidden beneath a false panel, she found something Daniel must have hidden deliberately, a small envelope of photographs. "Ah!" Her hands shook as she spread them across the desk. The images were grainy, taken in secret. They showed Richard, Daniel's partner, meeting with contractors Clara didn't recognize. One image caught her breath, Richard speaking with Michael outside the factory gates late at night, their faces grim, their hands clasped in a deal. O-R-E-O-Y-X. Clara pressed the photographs to her chest. Daniel had known something. He must have suspected betrayal, but hadn't lived long enough to reveal it. The truth was close. In town, rumors traveled faster than wind. Clara made quiet visits to shopkeepers, old workers, even the janitor who had once swept the factory floors. She never asked directly, never spoke of her suspicions aloud. Instead, she listened. And in listening, she heard fragments of a darker tale. "They say the scaffolding wasn't faulty," murmured one man, his eyes darting around the cafe before lowering his voice. "The supports were cut deliberately," another whispered. "Funny, isn't it? The cameras always work, but that night every one of them failed, like someone wanted it that way." Each piece was small, but together they painted a picture too cruel to ignore. Daniel hadn't died in an accident. He had been executed under the guise of one. The revelation burned through Clara's veins like fire. Still, she kept her mask of mourning intact. If Richard and Michael had staged this, they would be watching her, waiting for any sign of suspicion. So she played her role with care, quiet, broken, dependent, But fate handed her the proof. She needed one cold, rain-soaked evening. Richard had invited Michael and several others to his countryside estate for what he called a gathering of remembrance. It was nothing more than a celebration of power dressed in black. Clara went not as a guest of honor, but as a silent observer, her presence barely acknowledged. The men drank heavily, their laughter coarse, their grief long forgotten. As the night deepened, Clara excused herself from the main hall, her steps echoing down marble corridors. She had learned to disappear into shadows, to make herself unseen. That was when she heard it, the muffled cadence of drunken voices seeping from behind a half-closed door. Her heart pounded as she drew closer. Inside, Richard and Michael lounged before a roaring fire, whiskey glasses in hand. Their words slurred, their masks loosened. "Can you believe?" Richard chuckled. "How easily it all fell apart. One scaffold, a few wires snipped, and poor Daniel crushed beneath his own empire." Michael laughed, louder, crueler. "And everyone calls it an accident. The police barely looked twice. If only Daniel had been smarter, he'd still be alive. For Naphtha how rare section'll be alive." Clara's nails dug into her palms, blood welling where her skin broke. She wanted to burst in, to scream, to claw their smug faces until they bled, but she didn't move. She stayed in the shadows, frozen by the weight of their words. Then came the dagger that twisted her heart. Michael, the man who had toasted Daniel as a brother, leaned closer to Richard and whispered with a grin, "And Clara? The poor widow doesn't suspect a thing. She clings to me like I'm her savior. If only she knew I signed his death with you." The room erupted in laughter, cruel and hollow. Clara staggered back into the hallway, her breath shallow, her vision swimming. Michael, her husband's friend. The man who had promised to protect his legacy, who had hugged her with feigned sorrow. He had been part of it all, her grief transformed in that instant. It was no longer sorrow but fury, molten and relentless. Yet she knew bursting into that room would do nothing but expose her. She had no power, no proof, only their drunken words and her own rage. So she walked away, quietly, deliberately. When she returned home that night, she locked the doors, collapsed against the wall, and let the fury consume her in silence. She wept, yes, but not for Daniel, not anymore. She wept for the betrayal, for the mask that Michael had worn so easily, for the empire of lies that had strangled her life. And when her tears were spent, Clara rose, her eyes dry, her jaw set. If they thought her broken, they were fools. She would not confront them, not yet. That would be suicide. Instead, she would wait, she would plan. She would sharpen her grief into a blade so precise, so merciless, that when it finally cut, they would never see it coming. No, the house was silent, the night deep. Clara stood by the window, staring into the darkness. Somewhere out there, Richard and Michael were laughing, believing themselves untouchable. Clara whispered to the night, to the ghost of her husband, to the storm gathering inside her. "They took you from me, but I will take everything from them." And with that vow, the widow's game truly began. Clara learned quickly that grief was not only an emotion, it could also be a mask, a cloak, a weapon. In the weeks after overhearing Richard and Michael's drunken confession, She forced herself into the role of the fragile widow. Every sigh, every trembling smile, every glance of confusion, she performed them as if on stage. Richard was the first to bite. He visited often, bringing flowers that still reeked of funeral lilies. He spoke with exaggerated patience, explaining business matters as though she were a child. "You don't need to trouble yourself with these numbers, Clara," he said one afternoon, laying contracts on the dining table. "Just sign where I've marked. I'll make sure Daniel's legacy is in safe hands." Clara lowered her eyes, feigning hesitation. I don't understand all this," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "Perhaps you're right, I can't manage it alone." Richard's smile stretched thin, shark-like. He believed her. Michael's visits were softer, more insidious. He brought wine instead of flowers, laughter instead of spreadsheets. He played the role of the concerned friend, sitting close, his hand brushing hers under the guise of comfort. "You shouldn't be alone so much," he whispered one evening, his voice dripping with suggestion. "Daniel would want someone to look after you." Clara forced a shiver, withdrawing just enough to seem modest, yet not enough to drive him away. Let him think her vulnerable, let him believe her desperate for protection. In truth, she was watching, cataloging every weakness he revealed. His nabraho revealed his nilo, his vanity, his hunger for power, and his lust. But while the men circled her inheritance like vultures, Clara built something they could not see, an army of shadows. Her first ally was Andrew, an overlooked accountant who had once worked quietly in Daniel's company. Gray-haired hunch dismissed by Richard as background noise, Andrew held more knowledge than anyone suspected. Clara found him in a cramped office above a bookstore, his desk buried in ledgers. When she approached, he eyed her with suspicion. "I don't want trouble, Miss S. Hale," he muttered. "I've kept my head down all these years." Clara removed her veil, letting him see the steel in her eyes. "They killed my husband," she said, "and they are dismantling everything he built. If you help me, you won't just be an old man with forgotten papers. You'll be the one who brings them down. You'll be the one who brings them down." Andrew hesitated, then slowly slid a drawer open. Inside lay boxes of files, copies of transactions Richard thought erased. His loyalty shifted that day, not because of Clara's grief, but because she gave him purpose. Her second ally was less refined Jacob, a factory worker with grease-stained hands and a limp from years of labor. He had adored Daniel, who treated workers with respect, unlike Richard, who cut corners and wages at every turn. Clara found Jacob drinking outside a tavern, cursing the company that had cast him aside. They called it an accident, Jacob spat, eyes bloodshot. "But I know those supports didn't just fall." Clara placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then stand with me. Help me prove it." Jacob grinned, a grin missing teeth but filled with rage. For Mr. Hale, I'll see those bastards burn." Her final piece was the most dangerous, a private investigator named Elias Cross. Once a detective, now disgraced for pushing too hard against corruption. He lived alone, his office smelling of smoke and whiskey. Clara laid Daniel's photographs on his desk, the ones of Richard and Michael at the factory. I want the truth," she said. Cross leaned back, eyes narrowing. "Truth's expensive and dangerous." Clara leaned forward, her voice low and steady. "Not as expensive as silence, not as dangerous as crossing me." The silence stretched before Cross finally smirked. "You've got fire, widow. Fine, I'll dig." With her allies in place, Clara's double life began. By day, she remained the fragile widow, soft-spoken, leaning on Richard's guidance, enduring Michael's invasive comfort. By night, she sifted through Andrew's ledgers, listened to Jacob's whispers from the factory floor, and studied Elias's reports of bribes, secret meetings, and forged documents. Slowly a web unfolded. Richard was greedy beyond measure, siphoning funds through shell companies. Michael was careless, spending money he couldn't account for, his arrogance making him sloppy. Both men underestimated Clara completely, and that was their greatest weakness. Clara sat one evening in Daniel's old study, the fire casting long shadows on the walls. Spread before her were documents, photographs, and notes. Each page was a weapon waiting to be drawn. She thought of Richard's greed, Michael's vanity, their lust for power and for her. Revenge would not come with screams or gunfire. It would not be a blade in the night, no. It would come with patience, with whispers, with masks. She would let them destroy themselves, one careful push at a time. Clara closed Daniel's locket in her hand and whispered, "They think I'm helpless, but I am the storm they cannot see." And so the widow sharpened her silence into a weapon, preparing for the game that had only just begun. Michael had always prided himself on charm. He wore loyalty like a tailored suit, switching it out whenever fashion demanded. And Clara, with her quiet eyes and soft-spoken words, became his newest accessory. She let him believe it was his idea, visiting her more often, lingering late into the night, his hand brushing against hers, his voice dipped in false sympathy. Clara responded just enough to fan the fire, a glance too long, a smile that faded into sorrow, an invitation to stay for one more glass of wine. Oh, Michael drank it all in, mistaking her silence for weakness, her hesitance for longing. Every compliment he whispered, every boast he made about the empire he would protect, she stored away. His vanity was a door, and she was learning to unlock it piece by piece. Meanwhile, Richard believed he was winning an entirely different game. Clara allowed him to take control of Daniel's business accounts, nodding as he explained complex figures, pretending confusion at even the simplest sums. She signed documents where he pointed, let him shuffle assets where he pleased. But Andrew, her quiet accountant, tracked every move in the shadows. Each false invoice, every siphoned dollar, was copied and logged. Richard thought he was bleeding Daniel's empire into his own pockets, unnoticed, but Clara was watching him dig his own grave one greedy stroke at a time. The first crack appeared between the two men during a dinner at Richard's estate. Clara sat at the long oak table, the picture of fragile composure, while the men drank heavily. Michael, emboldened by whiskey and her carefully placed smiles, leaned across and said, "Clara deserves better management than just dry numbers, Richard. She needs someone who truly cares about her future, about her." And Richard's eyes narrowed, the flicker of suspicion breaking through his polished mask. "And you suppose that someone is you?" he said, his tone cutting. Michael laughed, careless. "I've been closer to this family than anyone. Daniel trusted me. Clara trusts me. Perhaps it's time you step aside." The air at the table grew sharp, heavy with unspoken threats. Clara lowered her gaze, hiding the satisfaction burning in her eyes. The first seeds of mistrust had been sown. Behind the scenes, her allies fanned the flames. Jacob, the factory worker, spread quiet rumors among employees. Hints that Richard was pocketing funds, whispers that Michael was planning a hostile takeover. Elia's Cross, her private investigator, slipped evidence into the right hands, letting competitors and board members question Richard's stability. Andrew prepared reports that highlighted discrepancies in Richard's books, timed perfectly to raise eyebrows just when Michael's confidence soared. The empire Daniel had built, once steady and united, began to fracture under the weight of suspicion. Michael grew bolder with Clara, mistaking her orchestrated glances for affection. One night, after too much wine, he pressed her hand and murmured, "You don't have to keep pretending, Clara. Daniel is gone. We can build something new, together." Clara let tears form in her eyes, the kind that shimmered but did not fall. I don't know what I would do without you, Michael. You've been my only comfort." He kissed her hand as though he had already won. What he didn't realize was that she had recorded every word. Elia's had slipped a device into the lamp beside her chair, capturing Michael's drunken confessions, every boast, every slip, every truth he had thought hidden. Richard, meanwhile, buried himself deeper in theft, convinced Clara was too fragile to notice. He moved money faster, signed deals in her name, and congratulated himself for outsmarting the widow. What he didn't know was that every false contract now had a mirror in Andrew's files, every forgery traced back to him. The trap was closing one careful turn at a time. Clara sat alone one evening, the firelight flickering across her face. She thought of Daniel, of his laughter in this very room, of the men who had betrayed him, and she thought of the two wolves now circling each other, each believing they owned her, each unaware that she was the one pulling their strings. Go patience, she reminded herself. Revenge was not a blade to swing wildly. It was poison, slow and silent, until its victim collapsed without knowing they had been struck. No, and as Richard and Michael began to doubt one another, to eye each other with suspicion, Clara smiled behind her mask of helplessness. The game was working. Storms don't arrive all at once. They gather quietly, dark clouds creeping across the horizon, a low rumble rolling beneath the earth. And as Clara played her game, she watched the storm gather around Richard and Michael, feeding on their greed, their vanity, and their fear. Michael was the first to unravel. Drawn deeper into Clara's orbit, he mistook her measured glances and soft-spoken gratitude for affection. It wasn't difficult to lead him further. A lingering touch, a tearful confession of loneliness, a glass of wine shared too late into the night. One evening, as rain tapped against the windows of her home, Clara let the inevitable happen. Michael leaned in, and she did not resist. Their lips met, sealing not a romance, but a trap. For every careless word he whispered in her arms became another nail in his coffin. "You don't need Richard," he murmured against her ear, drunk on arrogance and desire. He thinks he owns this empire, but I'll take it from him. I'll take care of you, Clara. We'll build something greater than Daniel ever dreamed." Clara smiled faintly, hiding the small recorder tucked beneath the cushion of the sofa. Every boast, every admission of betrayal was captured in perfect clarity. Meanwhile, Richard's world began to crack. Andrew, Clara's quiet accountant, had insured it. Reports landed on Richard's desk filled with subtle inconsistencies, contracts that didn't balance, numbers that bled red where he swore they had once been black. To Richard, it looked like sabotage. He paced his office late into the night, cigar smoke curling like restless ghosts. "Michael," he muttered to himself. "It has to be Michael. He's undermining me." The paranoia festered. He snapped at subordinates, accused loyal men of treachery, and grew careless in his own theft. What Clara wanted most was finally happening. Richard and Michael no longer trusted each other. The confrontation came during a board meeting. Clara sat quietly at the end of the long table, her black dress simple, her expression meek. Richard arrived tense, his jaw clenched, while Michael strolled in with the smug confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. "You've been moving money," Richard snapped across the table, slamming down a folder of falsified reports. "Don't play the fool. I see your fingerprints all over this." Michael's laughter rang out sharp and cruel. "You're losing control, Richard. Blaming me won't fix your incompetence." "No?" The board members shifted uneasily, whispers darting across the room. Clara lowered her eyes, her hands folded in her lap as though distressed by the hostility. But inside, her pulse quickened. The storm was breaking. When the meeting adjourned in chaos, Michael stormed toward Clara, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "You see what he's become? Bitter, paranoid. He'll destroy everything Daniel built if we let him. But with me," his hand lingered on hers, "with me, you'll be safe." Go. Richard, watching from across the room, saw the gesture. His suspicion flared into fury. At home, Clara let her mask slip in private. She stood before Daniel's photograph, her reflection flickering in the glass. "They're tearing each other apart," she whispered, "and soon they won't even need my hand to finish it." But even as satisfaction burned within her, another feeling clawed at her chest: fear. The more dangerous the game became, the closer she drew to discovery. If either man glimpsed the truth behind her helpless facade, her revenge would collapse in an instant. And yet she pressed on because storms once gathered cannot be stopped. They must break. The night came when all threads tightened into one knot. Richard confronted Michael at a lavish party, voices raised above the music, accusations spilling into the open. Clara stood between them, feigning panic, her eyes wide with tears. "Please," she begged, her voice trembling. "Daniel wouldn't want this. Don't fight." But the men no longer heard her. Their loyalty was shattered, their greed consuming them both. And Clara, standing in the middle, appeared to be a fragile widow caught in the crossfire. In truth, she was the lightning rod drawing the storm toward its peak. The celebration was Richard's idea. A grand affair meant to show the world that Hale Industries had not faltered after Daniel's death. Crystal chandeliers glittered overhead, violins filled the ballroom with delicate music, and glasses of champagne sparkled like liquid gold. To the guests, it was a night of power and wealth. To Clara, it was the battlefield. She entered in silence, draped in black silk that flowed like shadow. Every head turned, whispers trailing behind her. "The widow!" they murmured. She accepted their stares with quiet grace, her mask flawless. Only she knew that tonight the mask would fall, not hers, but theirs. Richard strutted across the floor, shaking hands, boasting of new contracts. He was radiant with arrogance, blind to the rot beneath his empire.
"Oh."
Michael followed at his side, smiling too widely, whispering too often, as if desperate to prove his control. Their alliance was now brittle glass, one strike away from shattering, and Clara was holding the hammer. When the speeches began, Richard took the stage, his voice booming. He praised Daniel's legacy, claiming the company was thriving under his stewardship. The audience applauded, oblivious. Then Michael stepped forward, draping an arm around Richard's shoulders, pretending unity. That was Clara's cue. She rose slowly, her heels clicking against marble as she moved toward the stage. "Forgive me," she said softly, her voice carrying through the microphone as Richard turned, startled. "But I think the guests deserve to hear another perspective." Richard frowned. Michael smirked, ready to savor what he thought would be her floundering. Clara reached into her clutch and lifted a small device. She pressed play. Michael's voice filled the ballroom, unmistakable, slurred with whiskey, yet damningly clear. "You don't need Richard. He thinks he owns this empire, but I'll take it from him. I'll take care of you, Clara. We'll build something greater than Daniel ever dreamed." Gaps rippled through the audience. Murmurs swelled. Board members stiffened, eyes darting between Michael and Richard. Richard's face drained of color. Michael lunged forward, stammering, She's twisting this. It's nothing, you know? But Clara wasn't finished. She held up another recording. Richard's voice, low and cruel, spilled from the speakers. One scaffold. A few wires snipped, and poor Daniel crushed beneath his own empire. The ballroom froze, the music had stopped, the laughter gone, only silence, thick and horrified, filled the air. Michael turned on Richard, shouting, "You fool! You let this out!" Richard bared his teeth. "You were there too, don't deny it." The two men erupted, their polished masks stripped away, revealing the monsters beneath. Security rushed forward, board members recoiled, reporters scribbled furiously. Clara stood calm amidst the chaos. She turned to the board. "For months, these men have stolen from this company, from my husband's legacy. I have the documents, the accounts, the witnesses. Everything you need is already in your hands. Andrew's carefully prepared files, Jacob's testimonies, Cross's investigations, all of it had been delivered to the board. Days earlier, I'm to detonate with tonight's revelation. Richard's crimes sprawled across forged contracts, siphoned accounts, offshore laundering. Michael's betrayal shone in his words, his arrogance immortalized on tape. The empire they had stolen collapsed around them in minutes. Police entered as the ballroom descended into chaos. Clara had made sure they were waiting. Officers shoved through the crowd, handcuffs gleaming under the chandeliers. Richard raged, cursing Michael as he was dragged away. Michael begged, his mask of charm dissolved into pathetic desperation. The guest whispered, eyes wide, as both men, once pillars of wealth and respect, were hauled into the night like common criminals. Clara did not smile. She simply watched, her veil of grief now a crown of quiet power. As silence returned, she stood at the podium. "My husband was murdered for greed," she said, her voice steady. "The men who called themselves his friends destroyed his name, his company, his life. Tonight you have seen their truth, and you will see justice done." Applause did not come. The room remained heavy with shock. But Clara did not need their approval. She had already won. Later, alone in Daniel's study, Clara lit a single candle. She placed it beside his photograph, the flickering flame reflecting in her eyes. "I told you I would find the truth," she whispered, "and I told you I would make them pay. She closed the locket around her neck, no longer a talisman of grief, but a seal of victory. Richard and Michael were alive, but stripped of everything, power, fortune, freedom, and for Clara, that was the perfect revenge. Death would have been too merciful. Living with their downfall was far worse. Niall. The storm had broken, and she stood in its calm center, unshaken. The widow had played her game, and she had won. The mansion was quiet now. Once, its halls had echoed with Daniel's laughter, with meetings and banquets, with the hum of a thriving empire. Now only silence remained, broken by the distant ticking of the grandfather clock in the corridor. Clara stood at the window of Daniel's study, gazing out over the city skyline. The lights glittered like jewels, but they no longer looked beautiful. They looked fragile, like glass waiting to be shattered. The empire Daniel had built was hers now. Every asset Richard had stolen, every share Michael had coveted, all of it had fallen neatly into her hands. The board, shaken by scandal, had named her the rightful head. The newspapers praised her courage, the courts praised her evidence. The world called her a survivor, a woman who had faced tragedy and triumphed, but Clara knew better. She was no survivor, she was a conqueror. She walked slowly across the study, her hand brushing the back of Daniel's leather chair. She remembered the first time she had seen him sit there, papers scattered, glasses perched on his nose, smiling as he explained numbers she barely understood. He had built everything with patience, kindness, integrity, and now it was hers, won not with kindness, but with lies and manipulation. On the desk sat a folder. Inside were the photographs, the recordings, the ledgers, every weapon she had used to destroy Richard and Michael. She should have burned them. She should have erased the shadows of betrayal and moved forward, but she didn't. She couldn't. She kept them close, as if they were not weapons of the past, but tools for the future. In the quiet, she wondered, when had she crossed the line? Was it when she pretended to be helpless, letting Michael's hand linger too long? When she whispered false gratitude to Richard, feigning dependence, while recording every sin? Or was it tonight when she stood before hundreds and ripped their lives apart without flinching? She told herself it was justice, that Daniel would have wanted her to avenge him. But another voice whispered in the dark, Daniel had believed in mercy, in honesty. Would he have recognized the woman she had become? Clara looked at her reflection in the window. The veil of mourning was gone, the softness in her eyes had hardened into steel. She was no longer the wife who laughed in gardens, nor the widow who wept by the coffin. She was something colder, sharper, more powerful. A knock came at the door, Andrew loyal as ever, bringing reports, Jacob, waiting for instructions. Elia's cross, asking what shadows she wanted unearthed next. They all looked to her now, not as a widow, not even as Daniel's heir. They looked to her as a queen. Clara dismissed them with a nod, her voice calm, controlled. When the door closed, she sat in Daniel's chair, the leather sighing beneath her. She placed her hands on the desk, her posture regal, commanding. The world would remember Richard and Michael as criminals, their legacies destroyed. But it would remember Clara as the woman who had risen from ashes to rule. And yet, in the stillness of the night, one question echoed in her heart, sharper than any victory. Had she avenged Daniel, or had she replaced him with something far darker? No, Clara closed her eyes, the city's lights glimmering against the glass like 1,000 watchful eyes. She whispered into the silence, her voice barely audible. I won, but at what cost? The clock ticked on. The candle beside Daniel's photograph burned lower, its flame wavering. And in that flicker, it seemed almost as though Daniel was watching her, not with pride, but with sorrow. The widow's game was over, and the queen sat alone,